"You can go up for Ard, Bear," he said as Paddington clambered aboard. "Keep a sharp lookout and listen for me instructions." After touching the brim of his sou'wester with his paw, Paddington hurried along the deck until he reached the front of the boat. He wasn't quite sure what he was supposed to look out for, but he felt very pleased he'd brought his opera glasses along, and he spent several moments peering through them at the horizon. Although he didn't want to offend Mrs. Bird after all the trouble she had taken, he was beginning to wish he'd taken Admiral Grundy's advice and kept his sailing outfit until a storm blew up. Apart from the fact that it was a hot day, his braces kept slipping off his shoulders, and he had to hold his trousers up with one paw, which made keeping a lookout very difficult. He was suddenly startled out of his daydreams by a roar from the back of the yacht. "Stand by, Ferrard!" bellowed the Admiral as he inspected his ship. "Watch the Bergie," he shouted, pointing to a small triangular flag which flew at the masthead. "Tells you which way the wind's blowing," he explained to Mrs. Bird, who was sheltering in the stern beneath her sunshade. "Most important. Get ready to splice the main brace down below," he called to Mr. Brown, who was somewhere in the cabin. "Stand by to cast off up for Ardbear." From his position in the front of the Admiral's yacht, Paddington was getting more and more confused by all the shouting. Setting sail was much more complicated than he had imagined. First of all, he thought the Admiral had said something about watching a birdie, but the only birds he could see were seagulls, and most of those seemed to be asleep. Then the Admiral had bellowed something about splicing his braces. Paddington was most surprised by the last order for, although his trousers were getting lower and lower, he hadn't realized anyone else had noticed, and he hastily picked up a coil of rope and began tying it round his middle to be on the safe side. "Stand by!" bellowed the Admiral. "I'm going to haul up me mainsail. Nothing like a good sailing craft," he continued with satisfaction as he pulled away at the rope. "Can't stand engines myself." "I must say it's a lovely sight," began Mrs. Brown as the large white sail billowed out in the breeze. She broke off and stared at the Admiral. "Is anything the matter?" she asked. "Where's that young bear feller of yours got to?" exploded the Admiral. "Don't tell me he's fallen overboard." "Good gracious!" exclaimed Mrs. Bird anxiously. "Where on earth can he have got to?" The Browns looked over the side into the water, but there was neither sight nor sound of Paddington. "Can't see any bubbles," said the Admiral. "And as for hearing anything, couldn't hear a ship's siren with all that jabbering going on ashore, let alone a bear's cries." The Browns looked up. Now that the Admiral mentioned it, there did seem to be a lot of noise going on. Quite a number of the fishermen on the quay were waving their arms, and several were pointing up at the sky. "Good grief!" exploded the Admiral as he stood up and shaded his eyes against the sun. "He's up aloft. Got himself hoisted to me mainmast." "I was only splicing my braces," gasped Paddington, looking most offended as he was lowered back down onto the deck. "I was having trouble with my oilskins, and I think I must have picked up the wrong rope by mistake." "I think," said Mrs. Bird, quickly pouring oil on troubled waters before the Admiral had time to speak, "you'd better sit in the back with me out of harm's way." Already quite a large crowd had collected on the quayside, and she didn't like the look on the Admiral's face. It seemed to have gone a rather nasty shade of purple. Paddington dusted himself down and then settled thankfully in the seat alongside Mrs. Bird, while order was restored and the Admiral once more made ready to sail. Within a matter of moments, everything was shipshape, and before long they found themselves skimming through the open water outside the harbor. While Jonathan and Judy sat on the deck watching the wash of the waves breaking over the bow of the yacht, Mr. Brown set up his rod and line, and even Paddington had to go over the stern with a piece of string and a bent pin which Mrs. Bird found in her handbag. It was all so new and interesting that it seemed no time at all before they found themselves on the island. Apart from all the Admiral's things, Mr. Brown had brought along a tent and a large hamper of food which Mrs. Bird had bought in the village store, and while Jonathan, Judy, and Paddington made ready to explore the island, the Admiral and Mr. Brown began unloading the yacht. It was as they turned to go back for their second trip that the Admiral suddenly let out an extra loud bellow and began pointing out to sea as he danced up and down the beach. "It's adrift!" he cried.